Okay, welcome back, new 303. Okay, so for this next section, we're going to be starting to get deeper into the questions around the multiple self. Now, as you can see, we've already been building up, something of a set of hypotheses around this, looking at questions like psychodynamics and the idea of sort of multiple independent centers of processing in the mind or brain. And we've already talked somewhat about the autonomous functions, okay, of the unconscious. So we've discussed things like blind sight and a few functions of this kind where under certain specified conditions, right, it seems as though unconscious processes can occur, right? Things can occur which are not sort of consciously maintained, and yet seem to still show complex information processing, complex interaction with the environment, et cetera, et cetera. The sort of larger implication of this that we are going to touch on as we go is this idea around the multiple self. Now, you'll have already seen this sort of intimated within the psychodynamic material, right? As I said in the section on sort of Jungian psychodynamics, when we are considering complexes, we're considering them as autonomous or semi-autonomous agents, right? So, I took some pains to describe them as being dynamical, as being living, right? And I used some very specific language there when I said that they have sort of their own point of view, right? Their own, desires, their own goals, their own means of operation. Now, when people consider this, and certainly when they experience it in one way or another, especially in sort of therapy or cases such as the ones that we're going to look at today, which involve sort of really, really striking examples of this, it's frankly a bit spooky for them, right? It's often a little off-putting and strange to have the idea that there is an agent which is distinct from your regular consciousness operating within your mind, operating within your body, right? There's a distinct spookiness to it. And I think one of the things that you'll see when we kind of dig into this is that, there are good indications that these sorts of multiple phenomena have in fact occurred through many human cultures through history, and that in fact very often by the sort of theory of the course, they've been interpreted in supernatural terms, right? So as issues of spirit possession, right? And this kind of thing, right? This idea that there's more than one person in a body is very often going to be interpreted within the cultural context of the culture in question. So this idea that there are, in some sense, multiple agencies operating within a single mind or a single brain is a spooky, striking idea. And it's counterintuitive to people. Now, of course, I framed this off the bat within the context of the course by saying that we are not singular unitive beings, right? We are not singular unitive beings. And we're going to go through a bunch of these examples today as a way of sort of underlining this. So the first thing that we need to kind of touch on before we start getting into this notion of multiplicity is the general concept of dissociation. So the word dissociation, when we hear it, and it is, I add dissociation, not disassociation. I know some people for whom that's a tremendous pet peeve, so I'll just underline it now. It's dissociation, not disassociation. So don't write disassociation in your papers. It's dissociation. So dissociation is one of these terms that has picked up greater currency as people have become somewhat more sort of trauma aware and trauma informed. And dissociation, by that standard, often takes on a rather kind of negative tone, right? So people talk about being dissociated or experiencing dissociation, and they're talking about it in sort of negative terms. So some examples of this that we might think of, right, are when people are experiencing depersonalization, right, where their environment seems fine, but they have a lost sense of themselves, right? They don't feel themselves. They sort of don't feel integrated in some important sense. Or derealization, they feel themselves, but the world seems strange and loose, like the world seems not quite real, okay? There is a kind of coherence or continuity, a fluidity, which is in each of those cases not operating. So with depersonalization, it's kind of the self, right? Oneself feels not quite together. And with derealization, the external seems not quite together. But this certainly isn't sort of the only instance of dissociation that we see. So one of the models for looking at dissociation is called the BASK model, and it's an acronym, BASK, and it stands for sort of the different elements that can occur in dissociation. So behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge. I guess I could do it with the fingers. Behavior, affect, sensation, knowledge, right? BASK. So the idea is any of these components can kind of peel away from regular processing, right? In regular processing, we expect that behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge are going to be relatively coherent and accessible to us. But in states of dissociation, those things can peel away. So you can imagine, right? One can, in a dissociative state, engage in a behavior and not be aware of it, right? One can experience an emotion, right? So affect, one can experience an emotional state and not be aware of it, right? One can experience a sensation and to not be aware of it. Or one can experience, right, have knowledge and, right, that knowledge can be blocked, generally speaking, memory, right? Occasionally procedural knowledge, but often propositional knowledge or sort of autobiographical knowledge, so memory. And these things can also trigger. So in cases of dissociation, right, when people have experienced something traumatic, right, so post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that, or they have other forms of trauma, dissociation is relatively common. But dissociation is not limited to those circumstances. So when you are working with clients, you often watch for certain forms of dissociation. If you bring up a sensitive subject and somebody suddenly blanks out or tunes out, right? They kind of glaze over and then there's a long pause and then they say, sorry, what were we talking about? That might be nothing, might just be that they, didn't get enough sleep or, have a coffee before they came in. But generally speaking, you flag it because it is often the case that these sorts of sensitive subjects, right, in somebody's background will cause some amount of dissociation, right? There's kind of like a field almost, their mind sort of steers around it, right? Deflects it away. And so people will have these moments of dissociation, they'll blank out. In some cases that can be very striking, but you see it with most people, right? If you're talking to them at length, you'll sometimes hit a subject and they'll just kind of tune out, right? In other cases, they will not really answer the question, which is sort of its own thing that you flag. So, you ask about something and then they give you an answer about something completely different. And then you say, okay, but, I was sort of asking about this. And they're like, oh, right. That also you might consider a form of dissociation. So dissociation in a sense is very common, right? The mind sort of peeling away. Now, as I said, dissociation has taken on this kind of negative connotation because people think of it primarily as a symptom. But that I think is not, it's not really fair. Dissociation is a core function of cognition. It's a core function of cognition. Indeed, it's central to a lot of things that we think of as being, is sort of important parts of our mind. So we all dissociate is what I'm getting at. Dissociation is not a symptom which is somehow limited to people that are experiencing sort of pathological forms of dissociation, but rather dissociation is something that we're all experiencing, right? Often throughout the day. So what do I mean by this? Okay, so first off, there are, of course, the minor dissociations. So for instance, right, when I was talking about talking to a client, you bring up a subject and they have kind of a deflection, they have a blank out and steer around it, right? That is remarkably common, okay? Indeed, so much so that Jung, in a really interesting and unfortunately not recently sort of looked at or replicated early experimental work, Carl Jung did some interesting experiments where he had a set list of words, okay, word association. If you're familiar with word association tasks, they've been one of the staples of psychodynamic therapies for a long time. So for instance, lots of us are familiar with, at least in passing, the notion of Freudian free association, okay? And this was Freud's technique where he would give a word, right? And then he would ask you to free associate on it. So, he would say cat, and you would say pet, furry, coat, warm, winter, right? So you can see that there is sort of a jumping chain of associations that come out from that. And basically, right, you in this method, you write down the free associations, and your assumption is that as you're going through this chain of associations, there's something of projective quality to it, right? It's revealing certain amounts of underlying structure within the person's own association set. Jung takes us an interesting step further. So he has a set list of 100 words. He hooks people up to galvanic skin resistance. Okay, so if you're not familiar with this, this has to do with the conductive qualities of your skin, and so it measures electrical resistance, often sort of via sweating or sort of moisture. And it's a key part in what we would normally think of as lie detectors, which, if you know anything about this, are not especially reliable, frankly, at detecting lies. But lie detector tests are galvanic skin resistance tests by and large, right? And the idea is that if you experience stress, you're going to see a jump in your galvanic skin resistance, right? So any kind of stress is going to have this incremental change in moisture and therefore conduction, and you're going to see a deflection of the needle as, right, the galvanic skin resistance goes to pass to your body. So this was a pretty burgeoning new technology at the time that Jung was using it, galvanic skin resistance, and could be used to measure sort of stress responses. So what he did was, he had a fixed list of like 100 words, trigger words, and he would go through and he would ask for an association. And this was a clever test in a lot of ways, because he would sort of, so you might say, he would say cat, and you would say pet, you know, and he would say house, and you would say tall, and he would say, you know, a wood, and you would say fire, right? You're getting a whole series of associations for each word. However, in addition to this, you would flag any word that saw a serious deflection of galvanic skin resistance, because that might indicate strong reaction. You would flag any word that the person paused for a long time, right? Because that typically was indicating some measure of dissociation, if they're sort of blanking out, right? So you say, you know, house, and they pause, and then they say tall, right? So you would sort of flag that on the list. And you would also flag, of course, what the specific associations were. So this is a common practice in any kind of word association task, where you're looking for kind of unusual associations, right? So you've doubtlessly seen sort of joke versions of this in comedies or cartoons or things, right? But the idea is, it's like if you say house and the person says fire, that's probably an unusual association to some extent, right? You might flag that. So it's this combination of things, right? The physical activation, right? The galvanic skin resistance, which isn't exactly a foolproof measure of anything per se, but does, indicate a certain amount of typically increase in physical activation, stress. The amount of time that people take on their responses, if it's immediate versus if they're sort of pausing to take time, or if they're blanking out, right? And then any particularly unusual links in their responses. So this was a test that Jung used, and you can see that right built into that is, right, this question around people hitching on certain things. And the list of 100 words was specifically constructed in such a way as to contain a bunch of relatively common words, and so to look at where people are having these kinds of reactions. In essence, it's a kind of word association task combined with physical measures that's designed to create a map, in a certain sense, of where people have their complexes, right? What are the terms around which they're having complexes or reactions? If you think about it in those terms, it's actually an extremely clever kind of idea. And many projective tests, and we'll talk about some of the other ones as we go. And we'll talk about projective tests like the Rorschach and the TAT later, but many of these projective tests rely on this kind of unusual associative stuff to provide a bit of a map. So an interesting experiment, especially considering it's like 100 years old. And I think something that I have some theoretical ideas about actually updating this task. I've been working with a colleague who is, let me think, right now they're at Harvard Medical, and talking about using sort of more modern database techniques on sort of word distance. But anyway, leaving that aside for a second, dissociation. So you can see that Jungian task is already relying to some extent on dissociation. You're looking for these moments where the mind is deflecting off of something. However, that's charting complexes. How does dissociation operate in our day-to-day lives? Well, let me give you a few examples. So For one thing, if you're daydreaming, you're dissociating, right? If you're daydreaming, you're dissociating. So think about daydreaming. Here you are, you're working on something, and then all of a sudden you're sort of staring out the window at clouds, or you're staring into space, and your imagination is going, right? You may be thinking about something that you did yesterday, you're thinking about doing your laundry, you're thinking about the date you have upcoming, or you're just engaging in daydream fantasy, right? You're imagining, scoring a touchdown at the big game, or going on American Idol or whatever, right? The point is, like, your mind is going, and it is not primarily engaged with what's going on in front of you. If somebody comes in and interrupts you, you may like, what, right? Or you may be engaged in a task, for instance, writing an assignment, and find that you kind of glaze out into your imagination, you daydream, and then you have to pull yourself back in. That's dissociation, okay? Anytime that we're engaged in an act of, say, reading fiction, same kind of thing. If you're reading a book, you're sitting down with a good piece of fiction in a book, to the extent that you are absorbed in the book, you're experiencing a kind of pseudo-hallucinatory state, right? Pseudo-hallucinatory. You would never mistake it, right? It's not like if somebody jars you out of it, you're suddenly like, wait, where's Harry Potter? That's not happening. But it's the case that you are experiencing this sort of pseudo-sensory state. As you go through the text, you are, right, sort of playing images in your head. Now, not everybody, I add, because some people, there's a small set of people who are aphantasic. I had an aphantasic student last year, which was quite interesting. So they don't apparently produce mental imagery, and there's some paradoxes involved in that, but that's beside the point. If you're reading a book and you're enjoying it, you're really absorbed in it, you are tuned out from your surroundings. And again, you will notice this. If you're really absorbed in a good book, you may get surprised by something that's in your immediate surroundings. Sometimes you're really absorbed, somebody will come up, say your name, you won't even hear it, right? You are in fact dissociated. You're peeled out of your regular aware consciousness and absorbed into this task of the book. Television. Television likewise requires you to be in an altered state. So much so that there have been some critiques of television. So there was a book back in the 1970s by Jerry Mandler called 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television. And one of Mandler's strong arguments, okay, hinged on an experiment that they did with kids. So they showed that watching TV tended to drop your brainwaves into an alpha state. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with this, okay, brain waves, such as they are these loose frequency domains that your brain tends to fall into in different states of consciousness, okay? You measure this with EEG. So, you would have a series of electrodes on your head. These days, there are fancy models that are relatively dry and comfortable. It used to be the case that you had to do this with like electrodes and goop that went into your hair. Now, they have relatively fancy ones that are much simpler. So as an example, I have a set of headphones here that has a gold-plated electrode, and these are, in fact, EEG headphones. So they can sense your brainwaves right through, and these are designed to basically sense your brainwaves and then modulate music and sound accordingly so that you can modulate your attention. I backed these, I think, on Kickstarter, Indiegogo, something like 3.5 or 4 years ago. Finally got them, haven't had a chance to play with them yet. But I've done a lot of research with EEG because I do neurofeedback research, and we'll touch on that more later. However, the point is EEG is measuring these loose domains of brain frequency. Now, brain frequency divides into a number of sort of bands of activity, okay? So if you're in regular attentive waking consciousness, you're in beta, which is quite high, okay? Beta typically starts around 14 hertz. People will be, they'll be divided on this a bit. But I think of beta as being sort of like 14 hertz, 13, 14 hertz, okay? And hertz is cycles per second. So this is like a frequency per second. So beta, regular attentive beta, is like 14. It goes up past that considerably. And the higher your beta range gets, the more activated you're going to be. We've shown very high beta signals in some cases. So like if your beta starts getting into like the 30s or even north of that, you're probably really quite freaked out, right? You're sort of hyper activated, hyper stimulated, hyper aware in various ways, okay? So beta, regular attentive consciousness. Just below beta, you've got the alpha band, okay? And that goes from like, let's call it 12 down to, I think, 9. In the alpha band, you are sort of slightly dissociated, slightly tuned out. You're very calm, typically, but you're not quite attentive. You're not focused in the same way. Okay, so alpha. Below alpha, we have theta, right? And the theta range tends to run from like 7 through to 4, I think, off the top of my head. I'm probably getting these ranges all wrong. But anyway, 7 through to 4. Theta would be very deep. So in certain cases of sleep and in cases of deep trance or deep meditation, you hit theta. And then delta, which is close to the bottom of the range, let's call it 3 hertz to like 1 hertz, you're dealing with, right, very slow waves. You would get this sort of thing with deep sleep, etc. So in a certain sense, you can see the frequency domain, the hertz, right, cycles per second, frequency domain, correlates, loosely speaking, okay, to the level of activity. That's a somewhat broad overview. So those of you who have neuroscience background are going, that's not quite right. And it's true. I'm giving you a very broad overview. But the point is this. Jerry Mandler, 4 arguments for the elimination against television. What they did was they wired people up and kids up to watch TV. And the idea was, if their brainwaves dropped out of the beta range, which is the range where you have sort of critical conscious attention, the TV would turn off. So if it dropped out of beta, which is where you're actively paying attention, the TV would turn off. Pretty simple, right? So if you dropped out of beta and into alpha, the television would turn off. And on average, I think kids could keep the television on for something like 20 seconds. Watching television, Mandler's argument was, based on this, is like inherently kind of hypnotic, right? It takes you out of this active, critical, conscious, attentive state, and sort of you drift into this, right? This slightly tranced out, daydreamy alpha state, okay? So the thing is that this isn't unique to television, which sort of undercuts Mandler's argument. It's not unique to TV, and it's not unique to movies, and it's not unique to plays. And it seems as though a dissociative state is in fact required for you to enjoy these things. Why? Well, so for one thing, because you tend to tune out your surroundings, right? So like a book or like daydreaming, that tuning out your surroundings and sort of being invested in what's going on in front of you is typically a mark that you are dissociated in some way. However, above and beyond that, if you think about it just briefly, you'll realize that the sort of emotional reactions that we have to this kind of fiction are in some sense almost intrinsically dependent on some measure of dissociation. Because we have emotional reactions even though we know that what we're looking at isn't real, right? So as an example of this, right, you will experience sadness or joy or terror or laughter or something, even though what you're looking at isn't real. Now, in some cases, what you're receiving is something where you yourself are laughing, but in many cases, right, what you're experiencing is a vicarious emotional reaction to what's going on screen, even though you know that they're actors, that it is not real, right? Now, the question is, when you know that it's not real, which part of you knows that? Some relatively high-level part of you clearly knows, oh, this is just fiction, right? But other parts of your mind or brain, right, are taking it very seriously indeed, right? They're taking it very seriously indeed. So, you know, as an example, I like horror movies. I'm a big horror movie aficionado. My favorite films are horror films. And, you know, I remember as a kid, right, watching, I think it was American Werewolf in London. And my mom does not much care for horror movies. She used to sort of watch them through a hole in a blanket. But at a pretty young age, 3 or something, I would be watching these films. And when she was sort of watching them through a blanket and being terrified, I would say to her, like, Mom, it's just a movie, right? But if you think about the experience that you have, right, a good horror movie is in fact genuinely kind of scary, and not just in the jump scare surprise fashion, but like it fills you with a state of dread and concern for the characters. But it's also not real. You know it's not real. So what part of you is associating? Clearly, there has to be at some level of dissociation, because if the whole part of your brain was going, well, this isn't real, this isn't happening, you just wouldn't care, right? You wouldn't be invested at all. Some part of you, in fact, resonates with what's going on and takes it very seriously. And in some cases, you can see this turn up with fandom. So there are, every once in a while, weird cases where people will blur fictional lines around actors. So for instance, Star Trek, The Next Generation, Michael Dorn, who played a character on that television show, recounts a story of somebody approaching him at a Star Trek convention. And of course, within Star Trek, there is a fictional teleportation technology, which is the transporter beams people. And somebody walked up to him and in all seriousness said, "Michael, what does it feel like to be beamed?" Now, one would assume that this person understands at some level that this is fiction, and yet they were asking the question seriously. And before you think that that person is perhaps particularly, maybe a little bit unbalanced, this is actually remarkably common. So when Aaron Eckhart had his relatively breakout role in The Company of Men, where he plays a not nice human being, good film, but like dark, and he is a not nice human being. He had people slapping him in the face on the street for like months. I don't know how often he actually got slapped, but he had people like being nasty to him as though he was the character he was portraying as an actor, right? When certain things happen in soap operas, it used to be not uncommon for the network to get inundated by letters, right, of people who were deeply, deeply upset about what had happened, and often clearly making some kind of conflation between the actors and the characters. This is relatively common. Now, you can look at that and, it's easy for all of us to look at that and go, ha, 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 right? But the point is, at some level, your brain is necessarily doing this. It's taking it very seriously, right? Because if it weren't, you wouldn't get invested. You wouldn't enjoy it. So there's necessarily a state of dissociation going on between the part of your brain that's like, this isn't real, and the part that is, in fact, emotionally invested in it, right? Okay. Now, to some extent, right, the critique has been leveled periodically, right, around, kids, for instance, watching, violent movies or horror movies or something. And people will often sort of blame this reality blurring effect on, special effects or something. It looks too real. But if you consider it, that's kind of a nonsense argument. And the reason it's a nonsense argument is that we become quite invested also in plays, like stage plays, drama, right? And so if you go to High Park in the summer and you go to Shakespeare in the Park and you watch them put on a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream or Hamlet or something, you may be quite invested in what's going on, but you're almost certainly not mistaking it for reality. It's not that the special effects on the stage are so compelling and so amazing that you're like, whoa, was that real? Like, it's all highly stylized. They're speaking a form of English very often that isn't really spoken anymore. It's, for 500 years out of style, 400 and a bit out, right? It's highly stylized, the circumstances stylized, the sets and costumes are stylized, et cetera, et cetera. And yet it is possible to become highly invested in it. So there is at the same time a piece of you going, this is just a play, but another piece of you, if you're engrossed, right, taking everything that's happening very seriously. That is indicative of dissociation. And indeed, if you couldn't dissociate, if you couldn't peel apart these two aspects of your mind, you wouldn't be able to enjoy it, right? You wouldn't be able to invest yourself and enjoy it. You would just look at it and be like, well, this is whatever. This is just people moving around. Like, who cares? You wouldn't take it seriously at all. So you need to be able to dissociate to some extent. Now, if you start sort of leaning over to taking it very seriously and not being able to maintain the sense that it's also a fiction, you're equally in trouble. So you will get this sometimes with people who are in various forms of psychological distress, where they will begin to take a movie or a television show to be a real event, and it causes them enormous distress. A fellow I knew 20 some years ago once made the mistake of taking a psychedelic. He had LSD and then was watching Blade Runner, and he became convinced that what he was watching was security camera footage. And it was extremely distressing for him. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. And it became extremely distressing for him, right? He lost, in fact, the dissociation, where he simultaneously knew that it was a piece of fiction, but was also invested in it. Instead, he just became invested in it, and it was highly distressing to him, right? It seemed like reality. Okay, so These are forms of dissociation that we engage in, all the time, routinely. And indeed, because one of the things we're talking about here is altered states of consciousness, this is sort of a useful place to point out that when we talk about altered states of consciousness, one of the core problems involved in that whole notion is the idea of normal consciousness, regular consciousness, right? It is, as you'll see, I think, a misnomer to think of consciousness as like, oh yeah, we go through our day and there's regular waking consciousness and then there's all this weird stuff. That's not how it works. Really how it works is that when you're awake, you are still in a bumpy plateau of different kinds of states of attention, states of energy, states of focus, states of identity, etc. And it's not uncommon for us to be sort of wavering up and down the frequency bands that I talked about, right? Now I'm in high beta, I'm kind of stressed. Oh, now I'm just focused, I'm in beta. Now I'm a little bit adrift, I'm in alpha, right? Slightly dissociated, I'm tuned out. That's not uncommon. We see a kind of cycle through the day. To say nothing, of course, of the cycles that we go through when we sleep, but we have 2 whole weeks on that later. So there is a range of conscious states. There isn't sort of a normal consciousness or a regular consciousness. There's just a set of states that we typically are moving in the course of a day. Okay, now just a quick tie back before we go on to sort of more interesting, or I mean, they're still interesting, but before we go on to somewhat more exotic or unusual forms of dissociation, I want to talk a little bit about where this interfaces with play, because we were talking about play before, and there is an important connection here. Play very often is a somewhat dissociated state, right? And if you consider it again, you will see that there is a relationship between the kind of dissociation that's operating when we appreciate a piece of fiction, right? Whether it be sort of a book or a play or a movie or whatever, right? TV show. And the kind of dissociation that is occurring when we see kids engaging in play, especially with toys. So let me give a quick example here. So when I was like 11, I think 11 years old, I remember very clearly the day my toys died, which is kind of a dramatic way of putting that. What do I mean by this? I remember sitting at the side of the couch with a variety of toys, some Transformers and like a He-Man and something else, right? Robot toys. And I think like a Sesame Street house and something. And I had them all set up around the couch in a way that I was very used to doing, right? That I was very used to taking toys and manipulating them. And many of you would have done this. If you had toys, dolls, action figures, you would have sort of played out spontaneous scenes of various kinds, sometimes with other kids, but sometimes by yourself, right? You would have played out spontaneous scenes. They would have had lines and interactions. They would have done certain kinds of things. Now, interestingly, in this particular state of play, there was not typically, in my experience, the sense that I was sort of making it up exactly. But this day, when I was 12, here I am, I'm sitting with the toys, I'm moving them around, and it's not working. It's not working. There's something about it. It feels weirdly forced. They're not sort of speaking for themselves. They're not animating themselves in the way that I had previously expected. And as I became aware of this fact, it was quite striking to me at the time. And as we will discuss later, I suspect has influenced a great deal of my thinking down the line. Like there was this moment where I realized basically that this was sort of part and parcel of growing up, that becoming an adult meant losing contact with this space where toys spontaneously sort of work themselves. You can think of lots of phenomena of this kind, right? So the kind of free play imagination games that you might have engaged in as a kid are probably considerably harder, if not nearly impossible, for you to engage in now. You know, if you want to give a kid, you know, like hours and hours of fun, give them a cardboard box and some like markers, crayons, or pencil crayons or something, right? And kids will spend hours, right? Pretending the box is this, pretending it's that. A kid can go into the woods, pick up a stick, and that stick immediately with the as not function can become any number of things: a staff, a sword, a wand, a gun, right? That kind of spontaneous quality of play, that blurry line around the as not, where kids are simultaneously maintaining, right? It's a stick, but also it's a blank, was also at work with the dolls or toys. And in that moment, I became acutely aware of the fact that it wasn't working. a spontaneous projective process wasn't working the way that I had been used to. Now, we'll talk about this more later, but I think that in many ways that particular instance influenced my longstanding interest in tabletop role-playing games, because by reintroducing a framework, a set of rules, right, that could be consulted, those games re-enable a kind of access into this form of spontaneous imaginative play that kids have easy access to, but adults actually find quite difficult often to engage, right? So it became an opportunity to move back into that space, right, by doing it in this somewhat more structured way. So we will talk about role-playing games more as we go. However, I want to point this out because there is a state within that state of play, which is also dissociative in much the same way as the response to television or something is. If a kid is making statements about the doll that they have, right? Janie says whatever. If you press them on it, they will say, oh yeah, it's just a doll, right? If they don't make that association, if they insist that it's a real person and whatever, and you say like, isn't it just a doll? And they don't get that, often at a certain point you're concerned, right? If a 16-year-old insists to you that their doll is talking to them, often you're going to want to ask some other questions about what's going on, right? That would be something of a concern. But at a certain age, for a kid to say like their stuffed animal has an opinion, or their toy bear has an opinion, or their doll has an opinion, is saying something that's not uncommon. Same thing with imaginary friends, same thing with sort of imaginary play and play spaces, right? This is all, a quite natural state for kids to engage in. And so think back here to what we talked about in terms of Vygotsky and play and internalization, right? The developmental psychologist Vygotsky, play and internalization. That as not function, which we discussed, is in many ways an inherently dissociative kind of function. It has to be to maintain as not, right? There have to be two different parts of the mind that are tracking at the same time in parallel, right? So all of this is to say, right, there are lots of different things going on in that play space, including projection, which we've talked about a bit, transference, which is sort of related, okay? But the key thing here is that as not function, right, requires a degree of dissociation. So dissociation, although we're used to thinking of it in sort of E terms, right, is in fact a normal part of the spectrum of general consciousness. We're all experiencing it. And if you couldn't experience it, there would be a bunch of relatively common sort of human experiences that you would not be able to access, right? So I want to point this out because people do get sort of concerned about dissociation, but dissociation is intrinsic. And once again, it falls into this line of it's only a problem if it's a problem, which is to say that if your dissociation is causing issues for you, well, then it's something that you need to address. But if it's not, right, if it's not really causing a problem, then you probably don't need to be concerned about it, right? Because it is a perfectly normal function. Okay, so continuing this. Actually, there's one more example I want to give on the play side, and then we'll get into sort of peeling back the layers of dissociation and some sort of radical instances of it in some way, or some interesting instances. So I wanted to tell an interesting story here that I think about my sister's old cat. You're going to wonder why I'm saying this. I've mentioned before that one of the sort of ongoing themes that we're going to touch on in the course is, of course, this continuity between the cognitive functions of humans and the cognitive functions of animals. They do differ, and we seem to have, in many ways, more sophisticated cognitive functions than animals, but there is a continuity there. And so often by paying attention to animal models of intelligence and animal behavior and stuff, we can learn a fair bit about how we ourselves function, right? I think that's a very important sort of aspect when we're attempting to understand this, and when we're attempting to understand sort of cognitive functioning in a general sense. So my sister's cat. So my sister had this cat for a number of years named Crackledax. Crackledax. And Crackledax had a fascinating behavior that I have never seen in a cat before, and that prior to seeing it in Crackledax repeatedly, I wouldn't have thought was sort of part of the cognitive capacities of a cat. It surprised me because it seemed more sophisticated in some sense than what a cat should be capable of. Now, I have been often corrected. My partner, who's very interested in animal cognition, shows me all the time sort of videos and clips and articles of animals exceeding my sense of their cognitive capacities considerably. So I've become a lot broader in my sense of what animals are capable of, but this was sort of an early instance that caught me. Okay, so what was this behavior? So when I used to stay at my sister's house with some frequency, I often was the last person up. People would go to bed and I would sort of stay up and read a bit later. And so I was often sort of around to see this. And Crackled Axe had a nightly routine. He did the same thing every night. So my sister and her husband and their 2 kids would go to bed. And when they went to bed, Crackled Axe would sort of do the same thing. It was a repeated ritual. First, he would head upstairs and he would basically poke his head into each person's room and just check on them, right? He would just like basically poke his head, check that they were in bed, whatever. Okay, so he would check on each of them in turn. Then he would come back downstairs, and Crackled Axe had this small stuffed animal, this small yellow rabbit named Bunny. He didn't name it Bunny, we did, but anyway, he had the small stuffed rabbit named Bunny, which he had had since he was like a kitten. And so he would head upstairs, he would check on everybody in the room once they had gone to bed, and then he would come downstairs, he would pick up Bunny with his teeth, and he would take Bunny into the living room, and he would set Bunny down. And then he would do this sort of fascinating thing. Now, if I made any noise, if I shifted around, whatever, if I called attention to myself in any way, he would sort of look up at me and stop. Right? He wouldn't continue. So I had to sort of remain quiet and silent in the corner as he went through his routine. But what he would do is he would set Bunny down in front of himself, and then he would start meowing at it. So he would set this stuffed yellow rabbit down in front of him, and then he would go meow, 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 meow for like 2 minutes typically. And then after doing this, he would pick Bunny up, curl up with him and go to sleep. Now, I found this a striking and fascinating display for a few reasons. So one is, the evidence now is somewhat mixed, but there are a number of people who believe that meowing is a behavior that cats primarily engage in to signal to humans. It's their sort of version of human speech. Right? So cats will tune their meows basically into frequencies that human beings find audible. It's an imitation of speech, right? It's their version of being able to communicate with us. So the fact that Crackled Axe was engaging in meowing in this way was peculiar because there were no humans that he was addressing. Instead, right, what was he doing? Now, one always has to be careful in these cases of animal cognition, right? Not to, as they warn us, anthropomorphize. But at a certain level, right, it's hard not to look at something like that and take, the intuitive position. If meowing is intended as a form of communication, he is meowing at the pet rabbit, is it not the case that he's, at the very least, miming communication to the rabbit? And after watching this many times, it was hard, of course, to shake the impression that basically Crackled Axe was telling Bunny about his day. Now, I'm aware one has to be cautious with these kinds of intuitions, but nevertheless, like regardless of how you slice it, if he's engaging in an act of communication at this rabbit, which is not a person, right, then he's engaging in a kind of projection that we would think of as being quite customary with young children, but I wouldn't have thought cats were capable of, frankly. I wouldn't have thought a cat was capable of sort of projecting personhood onto a toy in this way. It might enjoy the toy as an object, but for it to project personhood in a way that, right, it's engaging in some kind of communication or mock communication with it is very striking. Well, it turns out that actually there are lots of interesting instances of this sort of thing, but I leave you with that for a second because it covers that as, not space and play, and it's sort of a little bit interesting in that respect. Okay, so let's talk about dissociation. So as I mentioned, one of the ways of thinking about dissociation is to consider it in terms of BASC, right? BASC, behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge, right? So any given instance of dissociation is going to sort of peel one or more of those layers apart from the section of consciousness. And this tells us a little bit about the nature of dissociation. right? So what is dissociation? We can now sort of track this in terms of brain scans and brain science considerably better than we used to. And dissociation occurs when two normally integrated areas of the brain, okay, suddenly have reduced communication, often sharply reduced, okay? So two areas that would normally be in tight communication are suddenly not in tight communication. They're separated from each other. The communication between them drops, okay? So two areas would normally be in tight communication, but all of a sudden they're sort of separated out. And often this can leave an area, right, dissociated, in some sense orphaned. So you can imagine here, right, if, you know, we're talking about behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge, right? Let's say affect is dissociated. Well, that might mean that your higher conscious functions are in a sense dissociated from the emotional functions occurring in your limbic system, right? So that you're not experiencing an emotion. Now, we talked about this a bit before, but you may be asking yourself like, well, am I actually having the emotion if I'm not consciously experiencing it? And I would say, yes, it's not uncommon at all in therapy for people to be experiencing an emotion and to not be aware of it, okay? To be experiencing an emotion and not initially be aware of it. So people, for instance, often experience anger and they're not aware that they're experiencing anger until you sort of bring them in touch with their body, right? You bring them back in touch with their body and then they realize, oh, they're angry, right? They've been behaving in a way that's angry, right? They've been behaving angrily. All the indications are that they're angry, but if you ask them, they'll say, I'm not angry. When you bring them in touch with it, they're like, oh, I am angry and I have been angry, right? Sadness, likewise. People not infrequently will be experiencing a deep sadness, but if you ask them, right, by all reports, they'll say, no, I'm not sad. I don't know what you're talking about. When you get them in touch with it somatically, and right, often you get this kind of breakthrough where they realize that they are sad and indeed they have been sad, right? But they haven't had conscious access to it. They're sort of dissociated from that. So this drop in integration between two areas, okay, is what we mean by dissociation. So think of this, right? There is integration, where two areas are in relatively close contact and transparent information exchange, and then dissociation, where two areas, right, that contact drops, right, that information transfer drops, and they can be seemingly separated. So if your consciousness is here and an area dissociates from it, then you no longer have conscious access to these contents, or not as readily, okay? This is the basics of dissociation in some sense. Now, in some cases, we see this sort of artificially produced. So one of the videos that I've posted up is on split brains. And this comes out of a set of experiments that was done in the 1970s, where in order to halt certain forms of grand mal seizure, okay, where people were having seizure activity across their brain, surgeons conducted a relatively kind of radical surgery where they severed the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is, of course, a band of fibrous tissue which connects together the two hemispheres of the brain, right? So you got the two hemispheres of the brain and material underneath that, but you have these two hemispheres of the brain, and the corpus callosum connects the two with a dense band of nerve fibers. And to stop grand mal seizures from electrically propagating through the brain, they would cut, right, this corpus callosum. Now, that still gives the brain other alternate routes, right, that it can route information by. But what people saw in these cases where they cut the corpus callosum was actually the people behaved relatively normally, except under certain kinds of conditions. So if you watch the video that I posted up, you'll see these interesting conditions where it appeared as though there were sort of two separate consciousnesses, one for each hemisphere, right? Now, normally, the corpus callosum is shuttling information back and forth between the hemispheres quickly enough that there is a sense of integration and continuity. The two halves operate together. But with that band severed, you would see circumstances where the two hemispheres would behave quite differently and independently, right? So you could sort of present information selectively to one hemisphere versus the other hemisphere and get two different answers, two different responses, as though there was sort of two separate minds. Now, in a way, again, this shouldn't surprise us. If the sort of hardware of the brain can support one mind, why can't it support more than one? And given that we have sort of largely abandoned the idea that we're going to find like one tiny piece of the brain that's like, that's where consciousness is, okay? You know, given that that's the case for a bunch of reasons, which we'll get into at greater length, but given that that's the case, it's not surprising in a sense that two separate hemispheres can both yield information processing. Now, with the split brain experiments, they often stand by the idea that for most of us, being right-handed, that our dominant sort of main personality is in our left hemisphere, right? But our right hemisphere, nevertheless, has sort of its own perspective on things, its own information processing abilities, and so on and so forth. And indeed, in some very striking cases, may sort of have its own opinions about stuff. What does this mean? So if you look at one of the other videos I posted, you'll see the fascinating case of alien hand syndrome. Alien hand syndrome. So sometimes in cases where the corpus callosum is severed, right, to prevent grand mal seizure, you will get a thing where all of a sudden the person's left hand starts misbehaving. It operates on its own. And, in some cases seems to operate in relatively coherent ways. You go to open the cupboard, it closes it. You go to pick something up, it knocks it out of your hand. In some cases, right, it'll perform mechanical tasks. So you'll see in that video, like relatively sophisticated things that require it to do significant information processing in the world, right? So what's happening there? Well, there is some kind of consciousness, perhaps not as well developed as regular consciousness, operating within the right hemisphere, which controls the left arm because of crossover, okay? So your left hemisphere controls your right arm, your right hemisphere controls your left arm. So crossover, enough information processing that, right, the alien hand can, the brain is seeing through its eye, it can see what's going on. It can identify objects, it can manipulate them, and may have sort of opinions about things in a certain sense, right? It may behave in certain kinds of ways contrary to how the left hemisphere behaves. Watch that video, it's quite striking. And it's interesting because, of course, she immediately imputes agency, essentially speaking, to her alien hand. Now, some people would say, well, you're reading too much into this, but is she? Because if you consider the degree of sort of information processing and stuff that has to occur in order for the hand to manipulate objects in this way, right? It's very possible, in fact, that it is engaged in a relatively sophisticated form of cognition. Think back to Blind Sight and think back to some of the articles that we looked at early on, right? In the readings around the sort of capacities, like Hassan's article on the capacities of the unconscious mind. Right? Consider that stuff for a second. Okay, so split brain, a very striking set of experiments from the 70s that began to give researchers the idea that, oh, it may be possible under certain conditions for multiple consciousnesses in some important sense to occupy the same brain. Okay, so in that case, that's a surgically produced dissociation, right? By severing the corpus callosum and severing that band of tissue, you are surgically producing dissociation between the two hemispheres, and they both apparently behave somewhat independently. Okay, another case that we can look at, okay? And one that, there's lots of misinformation around, okay, is dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder. So this is what used to be called multiple personality disorder. That term has fallen out of favor, okay? However, this is a somewhat controversial, but now relatively well-established diagnosis where people who experience dissociative identity disorder have often radical shifts in their sense of self and their memory. So we've all seen sort of probably movie versions of this, which are often dramatized, but when you look at the actual cases, it might be the sort of thing where, a person, whatever, goes to bed one night, right? And then they wake up and it's like Tuesday and they're in a motel and they're wearing different clothes and they have no idea how they got there or what they've been doing. And when they've sort of engaged with this clinically, or when their loved ones start to notice it, there will be periods of time when that person will identify as somebody else. So instead of, identifying as, Linda or something, all of a sudden, this person is identifying themselves as Sarah, right? And may have, in fact, quite different tastes, personality, opinions, etc. Now, for a long time, dissociative identity disorder was pretty hotly debated. A number of years ago, I was lucky enough to go to a conference where I saw them present some of the evidence for DID that had come out of MRI and fMRI, so magnetic resonance imaging and functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a magnetic sort of brain scanning technique where you can image parts of the brain, but also where you can see sort of functional pattern changes. And what they had established was that in cases where people's sort of dominant personality had been switched with their alter, right, which was the going term, with their alter, so a secondary personality, for instance, there was often a radically different configuration of brain state. Now, in many ways, brain state is a bit like a thumbprint. You know, it's quite unique, that's quite identifiable. So to see these kinds of radical shifts was striking evidence that there was something going on. And indeed, the differences essentially manifested as differences in integration and dissociation within certain kinds of regions, right? So there was a dissociation and an integration occurring that shifted the pattern of connection within the brain and yielded a separate kind of personality. Now, in some cases that have been reported, dissociative identity disorder can be quite elaborate, right? So you can have, you know, not just sort of two personalities, but a number of personalities. And often the sort of hierarchy and relationship between these personalities can be quite sophisticated. If you get into this literature, it may be the case that, you know, personality A has mental access to the thoughts and memories of personality B, but not vice versa. So personality A knows what's happening when personality B is in the driver's seat, but B, when they're out of the driver's seat, right, is just blanks out. They lose memory. In some cases, it seems as though the alters, the personalities, are capable of communicating even when they are not in the driver's seat. So when they're not sort of in primary control of the body. And in some cases, you'll see that there can be sort of integration between these, right? Newfound integration between these alters, or further sort of fragmentation between the alters. So you can get a sort of a more complex ecosystem of personalities. Now, DID has frequently been linked to states of trauma, especially in youth. And as we'll see as we go further into this argument, there are some, I think, good reasons why this is. As I mentioned, right, dissociation is a natural property of the brain, natural and normal property of the brain. But in the case of sort of early childhood trauma of certain kinds, right, the dissociative mechanisms seem to be employed as a kind of protective mechanism. The main personality is somewhat shielded from the events that are inducing the trauma, right? And a secondary personality is constructed basically to deal with the problem. And then once that tendency is begun, it is not unusual for other personalities, other sort of specialized subpersonalities, to be deployed to deal with other kinds of things, right? So different circumstances will tend to employ different personalities, right? Now, again, obviously, this is the kind of thing where it's only a problem if it's a problem, and where DID used to be concerned, you know, we used to be sort of considered to be a psychiatric ailment that needed distinctly, you know, to be treated. And often that treatment involves sort of, you know, sort of forced integration and synthesis between personalities. There's been a significant movement in the last number of years to treat this in a neurodiverse fashion, basically to accord to the various personalities, you know, the essential sort of rights and dignity of personhood, and to look at it as merely an alternate formulation of the mind in some sense, right? A community in the mind instead of merely an individual. Now, you will see relative to the psychodynamic material that we're looking at that this, from that perspective, is not actually that different than what all of us are doing, right? We are all, by the psychodynamic perspective, a community of different, you know, agencies, as it were, right? Different centers of agency. And indeed, it's the case that we often do have specialized subpersonalities of various kinds that we develop for specific circumstances, right? The difference with DID is that these things tend to be more dissociated from each other. So there is less, right, access to each other's behavior, less access to each other's affect, emotional states, less access to each other's sensation, less access to each other's knowledge. It may be the case that there are certain things that one alter experiences, right, and other alters have no memory of, right? Skills that one alter picks up that other alters have no access to. emotions that some alters simply don't feel or can't feel or are relegated to feel. So in general, there is sort of a broader dissociation between all of these different modules. But in a sense, dissociative identity disorder, I will claim, is not operating in a significantly different fashion than, in fact, people's minds in general. Okay, another example. Hearing voices. So hearing voices, as I mentioned earlier, used to be sort of primarily associated as a symptom of psychosis and schizophrenia, specifically. And so hearing voices was actually taken to be one of the sort of leading edge symptoms of schizophrenia and was treated quite aggressively. However, in recent years, it's been shown that, in fact, hearing voices by itself can occur completely independently of other sorts of symptoms, right? So it is not, in fact, primarily, it does occur in schizophrenia, but it's not it's not only occurring in schizophrenia. You can have a situation where people simply hear voices, right? Now, that doesn't mean that that's not in some way distressing to them. So many of these accounts, when you read them or listen to these people speak, they'll talk about their voices, harassing them or saying terrible things to them. And there's a whole set of therapies that has emerged with people, speaking back to the voices in certain kinds of ways in order to try to form a relationship with them and to form some conscious association with them. But the point is that in and of itself, hearing voices is actually relatively common. And indeed, hearing voices is not even limited to these sorts of extreme cases where people are hearing what seem to be audible voices quite frequently. Most people experience hearing voices at one time or another. So it's an extremely common symptom of sleep deprivation, for instance. People get sleep deprived to a certain point and they will hear somebody saying their name, but there's nobody there. It's also extremely widely reported as a symptom of grief, right? Insofar as grief has symptoms. But when people are grieving, they will often hear, and sometimes relatively commonly see, but they will often hear the voice of the person who's died, who's passed away. So they'll hear their voice and then, right? Okay, now we're going to come back around to an ongoing explanation of this as we consider the idea that we discussed before of internalization and mutual modeling and what that means in this context. But as an example, my ex, whose parents died while we were in high school, has described for me that when she became a parent, she would often hear her mother's voice. And she didn't have a terrific relationship with her mother. Her mother was very critical of her. So she would hear her mother's voice criticizing her parenting. She was around the kids. And when I asked her, I was like, what do you mean by hear? She was like, hear. It's like I can hear her voice, right? If we consider this from the perspective of internalization and mutual modeling, we begin to wonder, like, okay, that module is still active and it's somehow impinging on consciousness in a particular way. It's able to intrude on consciousness with a seeming sense effect, right? So that's interesting. So hearing voices is an interesting instance where people pretty routinely experience what is pretty obviously a dissociation. If we believe that this is a naturalistic phenomenon, then some part of their mind is producing that voice, right? And it's impinging into consciousness. It's not just that the person is sort of thinking of the voice or imagining the voice, it's as though they hear it. It is a hallucination, right? So that is a relatively common form of dissociation. Another one that I think is quite noteworthy is the so-called third man phenomenon. Third man phenomenon. There's a fascinating book on this subject. So the third man phenomenon is very often reported when people are isolated and in extreme conditions in a small group. So say 1, 2, or 3 people, you get a lot of it reported with sort of Arctic and Antarctic expeditions, where it's a relatively low sort of sensory environment. And so what you'll get is this idea as people are sort of traveling, right, trudging through the snow, the tundra, whatever, over a long period, that there is another presence with them. Sometimes they will attribute that presence to a religious figure, an angel or Jesus or something, right? But they have this idea that there is another presence with them watching it, and they will report it in comment. They will all sense that there is this sort of presence accompanying them. This is so commonly reported that in the book, The Third Man Phenomenon, the author collected, I don't know, some 200 stories of this as it was reported, right? Now, that's not a scientific piece of literature, but when you get that many instances of something, at that point, you probably should step back and ask yourself, okay, this seems to be a phenomenon that's being reported. What's going on there? And it's possible, of course, to view it as a case of dissociation. A function is peeled off from consciousness in some way, but able to impinge on consciousness. And before you think that it's just a sense of presence, consider this, which is a fascinating story. Okay, this is one of the ones in the book. So there are two guys who are ice climbing. Okay, they're ice climbing an ice cliff. So they've got like, crampons, hooks on their boots, and they've got like ice pick, ice axe, and they're climbing. And they had like a collapse of the wall, an avalanche, okay? So the wall breaks and the two guys who are ice climbing fall. And the one guy sadly is, I think, pretty much instantly killed. I think he's crushed. The other guy is very badly injured. Okay, he's very badly injured. And he's taken enough head injury that he can't see very clearly. And so he's sort of stumbling out of the wreckage, right? And is trying to find his way back to civilization. And then all of a sudden, he hears this very clear voice speak to him, right? And it says, here is what you're going to do. Right now, there is blood running off the end of your nose. So you're going to walk forward and you're going to watch the line of blood in the snow. And if the line of blood ever crosses itself, that means you've gone in a circle. But as long as you keep walking, right, you will eventually get out of here, get out of this sort of glacier. So you're just going to walk and sort of let the line of blood drip off your nose until you find your way out. And he did. Now, as he reported that event, right, it very clearly seemed to him to be external, right? And obviously, right, if one happens to have a metaphysic that admits the supernatural, you might be inclined to be like, whoa, like that guy's got a guardian angel or something. But if we're going with a somewhat naturalistic account of this, we might wonder what's happening, because some part of his mind, in a certain sense, is thinking more clearly than he is, right? A phenomenon which, as you'll see, turns up more often than you might imagine. Some part of his mind is thinking more clearly than he is. And in this moment, right, of sort of isolation and stress, it impinges on his consciousness in a way that helps him survive. This sort of thing with third man phenomenon turns up. So again, it's another condition where under these sort of unusual conditions, it seems like the mind is capable of dissociating and producing a seemingly autonomous figure which can impinge back on consciousness. Okay, so another case in that sense of multiple self. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple more, and then I'm going to wrap this one up. But I want to look at a couple more that are sort of interesting cases. So one of these is the case of Kenneth Parks, 1987. This is a Canadian case. So I had already mentioned sleepwalking previously, okay, various kinds of parasomnias, but sleepwalking as an interesting instance where people seem to be unconsciously going through relatively complicated chains of action, right? So my niece, when she was little, used to sleepwalk, and it's a profoundly weird and spooky experience when somebody is sleepwalking. So they first discovered this when she like left the house in the middle of the night, went to the neighbor's house and rang on the bell and spoke nonsense, and the neighbors brought her back in her pajamas, kind of thing. But like, to think about this, she was asleep the whole time. She had no memory of it and was not quite making sense, right? So her eyes were open. Some part of her mind, brain, right, was processing its environment well enough to navigate out of her bed, down the stairs, out the front door, across the court, to the neighbor's house, to ring the bell, to, right? Sophisticated processing, but not with her conscious mind involved. So again, an interesting case of dissociation when we're looking at parasomnia, the case of Kenneth Parks. Oh, actually, one thing before we get to that. Night terrors are another interesting example. Sleepwalking is the thing, but night terrors. So kids are often given to night terrors. I, in fact, was given to night terrors. So this is where like the kid will start screaming and screaming like they're being murdered, right? But when you wake them up, they're not in fact having a dream. So this would happen to me as a kid, right? People would be, I would apparently be shrieking in terror. They would wake me up and they'd say, "What's wrong? Did you have a bad dream?" And I'd be like, "What? What are you talking about?" This is a bizarre idea, right? In a way. Now, I once had this explained to me in a way that I thought was sort of strikingly strange and spooky, which was like, well, your mind isn't involved. What's terrified in that case is your body. It's your body that's screaming. It's your body that's afraid. There's something so spooky about that to me. And it's October, we're coming up on Halloween, so spooky is okay. But there's something so terrifying about that idea to me. In any event, parasomnias. So parasomnias of course, you get a wide class of things. The relatively common sleeping pill Ambien has been implicated in a large number of parasomnias. We'll look a little bit more at Ambien later because it is generally a very strange, slightly inexplicable drug. But habitual Ambien users will often sort of do an Ambien zombie thing. So like they'll get up in the middle of the night while they're sleeping, go downstairs, cook breakfast, and go back to bed, but with no recollection of it at all. So, you know, people will come down the next morning and there will be like cold breakfast on the table because somebody with Ambien has developed a spontaneous parasomnia, right? Not just sleepwalking, but relatively complex activity, cooking food. However, this particular case, Kenneth Parks in 1987, was a fascinating case because Kenneth Parks got up, got in his car, drove across town, and brutally stabbed his in-laws, right? Then left and in a state of disorientation turned himself in to the police and was like, I think something horrible happened. And they noticed at the time that he had cut the tendons in his hand, which is really bizarre, right? He was in fact released on that charge. He was acquitted. And the reason he was acquitted was that they found that he had a complex parasomnia. I've had the chance to observe complex parasomnias on a number of occasions. People I know have had them and so on and so forth. And it is fascinating. You can get a surprising amount of complex behavior in a parasomnia. Now, I've never seen anybody do anything as sophisticated as drive a car across town and attack somebody, but it's not completely implausible, right? There is a dissociation between functions which are occurring unconsciously and consciousness. Okay. Last example. Well, it's a few examples, but we'll go through it. The last example is an interesting one to me, which is hypnosis, because hypnosis is dissociative. Hypnosis is dissociative. This has likewise been determined by MRI and fMRI sort of studies that hypnosis is dissociative. Now, every time I mention this, people are somewhat surprised because there's a lot of misconception around hypnosis. Basically, a lot of people think it's sort of made up, that it doesn't function. And I was always fascinated by hypnosis. And I had an interesting opportunity as a teenager. So when I was a teenager, I had a weird job, which is that there was a period of time where in the lead up to, make money to buy gifts and stuff for Christmas, I had a job selling tickets to a hypnotist stage show that came to my hometown. I do not remember how I got this job. And like, this is mostly kind of pre-internet days. So my job consisted in like opening a phone book up and cold calling people. And it's like, are you interested in hypnotism? And trying to sell them tickets to this show for a few weeks. It was not a great job. However, as a consequence of that job, I got front row tickets to this show. I was allowed to attend all 3 nights of the show. So I think I went twice. And it was interesting, right? Stage hypnotism is, a different animal than hypnotherapy, which I also have some familiarity with, and we'll talk about. But nevertheless, right, there are some sort of basic things that the hypnotist does. So the first thing that the hypnotist generally does is that he tests suggestibility in the audience. So he'll get everybody, I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to relax. And I want you to imagine there's a balloon attached to your hand. And the balloon is just drifting up and it's pulling your arm up with it. It's just, and then you look out into the audience after you've done this, longer spiel than that, and you watch for the people whose arm goes up. Why? Because often those are the people that are suggestible. And suggestibility, okay, suggestibility and absorption, but suggestibility primarily, are the measure that you want to look for when you're looking for people that are highly sort of hypnotically susceptible. Now, some people will consider hypnotic susceptibility to maybe be a function of being weak-willed or something, low intelligence, and that's not true at all. In fact, relatively high intelligence people with strong imaginations tend to be more hypnotically susceptible. So they tend to be more prone. To the extent that your imagination is quite strong and right, your focus and attention are good, you're likely to be more hypnotically susceptible. So he looks out into the audience to check for sort of suggestibility. Why? Because those are the people that he's going to select to bring on stage. So he goes through all the standard stuff, right? Convincing people they're chickens and giving them post-hypnotic suggestions and all that stuff. But the final thing was the really interesting thing to me because I was sort of right at the front and I could see on the stage. So he had the 5 people up and he starts, he's got them hypnotized and he's taking them through this hypnotic induction that they're out at sea in a sea kayak. okay? So here they are, and they're in a sea kayak, right? And then all of a sudden, he says, they look out off the side of their sea kayak, and they suddenly see a gray fin breaking the waves and coming towards them, right? And he starts describing the shark that's making an approach towards them. Now, what was interesting to me at the time was there was a couple people on stage who start paddling faster, but they're kind of smiling. They look like they're sort of hamming it up, okay? And you're going to get some amount of that. People who are not in fact hypnotized, but they're going along with the, they're going along with the whole thing. So they're hamming it up, okay, fine. And then, you get one person who looks pretty serious and they're paddling. And then you get the fourth person who's really paddling, like they look deadly serious about this. They're sort of paddling and they look really intense as they're kind of going. But then there was this girl on the end. And she was paddling her ass off. I mean, she was sitting on a high school stage, but in an auditorium, but she's paddling and paddling, and she was crying. There are tears running down her face, which I could see. Now, say what you will about the responsibility of stage hypnotism in this sense, because you worry a little bit about putting somebody into that state. And of course, at the end, it's not a shark, it's a dolphin. But as I sat and watched this person crying on stage, I thought, okay, I don't know what that is. I don't know what's happening there, but something is happening there. That's not nothing. I don't know what the explanation is, and I don't believe the explanation that the hypnotist themselves has proposed for what's going on. Like, I don't believe their language of explanation. However, there's definitely something happening there. That, I add, is the sort of general stance I want you to take towards this kind of material, right? It's like, you don't necessarily have to know what's going on to realize that there is something going on. Third Man, same thing. We don't have a good account of what's happening there, not yet, right? But there's something happening there. There's a lot of evidence, right? So maintaining that kind of open space. So I'm watching this girl, there are tears running down her face. And I think to myself, that's definitely something. So shortly thereafter, I had a friend whose father was a psychologist, and I asked him if I could borrow his hypnosis texts, and he happily obliged, right? And so, I started sort of going through these hypnosis texts and learning, hypnotic induction techniques, etc. Now, how do we know that hypnosis is a thing? Well, there's the brain scan question. But actually, hypnosis was formally put on sort of empirical footing relatively recently, 2007, by the RAZ lab in Montreal, the RAZ lab, so R-A-Z in Montreal. And what they did was, that's such a clever experiment. What they did was they established the existence of hypnosis with the Stroop test. Now, you'll remember the Stroop test. We talked about this before, right? So the Stroop test is the one where you have a word, which is the word for a color, like blue, but it is also presented to you in a color, right? So the word itself is colored, and it may be the same color as its word. So it's the word blue and it's written in blue, but it may also be the word blue and it's written in, say, the color red or the color yellow, okay? And the Stroop task is that as these are flashed up, you're supposed to call what color it is, not what word it says, right? What color it is. Now, as people's attention flags in various ways, right, you're going to see them lagging. So it's going to pop up, it's going to say blue, but it's going to be written in red, and people will say blue, no, red, or they'll just screw it up, right? And so, as I mentioned, the Stroop test is basically a whole cottage industry, okay, within psychology of testing our ability to control our attention. When there are other things pulling on our attention or exhaustion, et cetera, we're going to not be able to do Stroop as much, and we're going to have a bigger Stroop effect. Now, interestingly, Stroop effect is not sort of consciously affectable. We can decide not to do it, but there's such a strong automaticity associated with Stroop that we kind of can't shut it off easily, right? In fact, the decision to shut it off makes almost no difference at all. Now, there are a few things which do reduce people's sort of lag in the Stroop test. One is advanced meditators, interestingly, right, are capable of reducing their Stroop effect. And that's fascinating. We'll come back around to that, why advanced meditation may allow people a certain kind of attentional control over different streams of cognition in their mind, right? But the other, interestingly, is hypnosis. So here's the thing. Because Stroop is such a reliable effect, what they did was, simple experiment, they hypnotized people. So they did a hypnotic induction with people at the RAS lab. And then they basically hypnotized them into the belief that they couldn't read. Now, normally, think about it. The Stroop test, right, relies on the fact that reading for us is so drilled in, literacy is so automatic that it's right, it forms a stream of information that automatically interferes for us at the language center. That's the whole point of it. That's why it's such a reliable effect. Right? That's why we rely on it in psychology. So they hypnotize people. You don't usually do this waving a watch thing, but they hypnotize people. They do an induction, and the induction is that they can't read. And all of a sudden, people's Stroop goes down radically. People are just able to name the colors because they believe they can't read. Now, aside from that being a fascinating way, I mean, it's an ingenious way to prove that hypnosis is actually functioning. Let's take a moment for a second and consider what's actually happening. What's happening in that moment, right? And what's happening is that through words, imagery, and controlled attention, through getting somebody to relax and pay attention to what you're saying, you're inducing an artificial dissociation, a component of their mind that is normally so closely integrated that they cannot voluntarily turn it off. Literacy is instead separated enough from consciousness that it stops interfering in the way in which it normally does. That's striking if you really consider it, right? Just with words, just words. Words and following somebody's voice and attention, and they can cause a dissociation that separates out something that is normally beyond voluntary control. So that's how they demonstrated the existence of hypnosis. And note, what hypnosis is doing is inducing a dissociation. Now that suggests some really interesting things because people have made a lot of claims around, for instance, hypnosis as a way of doing pain control, right, for surgery and dentistry. So, right, hypnotizing high suggestibility subjects so that they don't feel pain, so that you don't have to use anesthetic. Well, that would be a dissociation if we consider the Basque model, right? That would be a dissociation of sensation. The sensation is occurring, but they don't have conscious access to it, right? So we're going to come back to that. But I want to give you one more example of hypnosis, actually two, of hypnosis that I think are quite fascinating. A couple examples. So some of you will have heard this spiel if you've done courses with me before, because I find it endlessly fascinating. But people are often surprised to find that in Ontario, the only method of smoking cessation, which is covered by OHIP, is hypnosis. The only method of smoking cessation, which is covered by OHIP, which is to say by public insurance, is hypnosis. Now, you have to have hypnosis done by a doctor. So the doctor is the one who has to bill, right, public insurance, OHIP. But the point is, it's the only method of smoking cessation that is covered, right, by public health care in Ontario. How does this work? So the way it works is you go to the doctor, right? And of course, they do a basic induction, right? I want you to relax. I want you to follow the sound of my breath, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then once you have that induction done and you are sort of, in a relaxed state, they take you back to when you started smoking. Because, as I like to point out to people, right? Whatever the reason was that you began smoking, it wasn't probably because you were addicted to nicotine. That isn't why you started smoking. You didn't start because you were addicted to nicotine. You may have become addicted to nicotine after you smoked for a while, and there are certainly, physical symptoms and stuff that go with that make it difficult to break the habit. It's unpleasant to break a physical addiction. However, that's not why anybody starts. They don't start because they're addicted to nicotine. They start for emotional reasons. They start to fit in. They start to stand out. They start to feel closer to a parent or to separate themselves from a parent. They, smoke to, rev themselves up. They smoke to calm themselves down. They smoke to pass time, right? There are all these sort of emotional management reasons that people take up smoking, initially speaking, right? So you get the person, right, relaxed in hypnosis, and you take them back to when they began smoking. And you ask them to imagine that person, the person they were then, and why they started smoking. And then you bring this person up in front of them. Now, as a brief divergence, for 1 second. You'll see how this is connected. There is a really interesting case from 1974. I'm going to finish that story, but there's a really interesting case from 1974 of a Japanese soldier that was discovered on a Pacific island. In fact, this happened a number of times, but 1974 is probably the most prominent version. So this island was supposedly uninhabited, and some fishermen go by the island and they see somebody on the island. So, they pull their boat up a little closer to see what's going on, and all of a sudden machine gun fire rips out of the island. And so they take off. So they go back to the authorities and tell them what they've seen. This is supposed to be an uninhabited island. And through sort of a series of circumstances, the authorities gradually figure out that the person on this island was a Japanese soldier that had been there since World War II. World War II ended in 1945. They found this person in 1974, so 30 years later. Now, this person had been on this island. They had been dropped off and basically told, look, if the Americans show up, machine gun them. They'd basically been dropped off. They had, a machine gun. And so every day they got up, they made their rice and collected their coconuts and oiled the machine gun and waited for an invasion of American Marines that was never coming because the war had been over for 30 years. But they did this really diligently. So they tried to flush this person out, right? They, among other things, tried to leave newspapers that indicated the war was over, and the person wouldn't believe them because the propaganda in the war had said that if the Americans won the war, they were going to completely destroy Japan. And so this person, was like, Japan's doing well, so that can't be true. And this is, it's propaganda. Wouldn't believe. And so finally they had to go get this guy's old superior officer who had long since been running a bookstore in Kyoto. He had to get this guy's superior officer and send him into kind of the jungle and say hey, it's me, you can come out. The guy trusted his superior officer. Now, this guy continued to fight World War II 30 years after it ended, which is a remarkable feat of will. And I ask you, when they finished up, how do you think the Japanese public reacted to this? Did they make fun of this guy? They're like, you idiot, you manned this island 30 years too long. No, they gave him a medal. And they sent him home. They gave him a medal. Why? Because even though his information was mistaken, the task he undertook was, right, astounding, heroic, right? Incredibly loyal and diligent and focused, right? Admirable in a lot of ways. Regardless of what you might think about war and soldiery, the point is the guy held this post 30 years by himself, right? Diligently. So there was an enormous amount of respect for him. So back to hypnosis. You conjure up the person who you were when you began smoking and the reason emotionally why you began smoking. And then you say to that part, I appreciate everything you did for me. And I appreciate that you're still trying to help me. But we're not there anymore. We're no longer in the back parking lot of high school trying to fit in with other kids. And so I appreciate everything you've done, but the war is over. Here's a medal. Go home. And you let this part of yourself go. You acknowledge their service, that they've been trying to help you all this time, and you let them go. Then you give a little bit of a post-hypnotic suggestion that people feel good, and you end the induction. And the thing is, the rate of smoking cessation for this technique is quite good. Often people will quit in one session, right? Not invariably, okay? And there are variations in people's suggestibility and so on and so forth, as well as the abilities of people doing the hypnosis. But the point is, in many cases, people quit in one session. My mom quit in one session this way. She had smoked for 30 years and she quit in one session with this technique. Now, that's a technique that seems to emerge in part from, I believe, from Robert Asiglioli's psychosynthesis, which I mentioned before, which is sort of a notion of subpersonalities or parts. But think for a second about what's happening here. And the reason that I use the Japanese soldier metaphor is that this is very often the case. We have these fragmented complexes and components of our mind that are running old emotional programs, but they haven't been updated. They're trying to help, right? But they have weird ideas about what's going on, or they don't have a very updated sense of what's going on. That's what's happening in the smoking case. If you remove the emotional quality of that, right, then all of a sudden, right, people just start dealing with the physical symptoms, which actually are relatively minor. It turns out the thing driving it a lot of the time is this unconscious emotional programming, which has continued to run long past its time. It's fighting a war from, a war that ended 30 years ago. So you respect it, you give it a medal, and you send it home. Hypnotic technique. Now think for a second again about that in terms of dissociation. In some sense, there has to be a degree of dissociation between you and the piece that is operating autonomously, but also there is a degree, right? In some sense, you are bringing the mind kind of closer, bringing it into the mid-range. Normally, that piece would just be plugged into your head and operating unconsciously, right? You would not be aware of it. It would just be continuing to affect you. Instead, you separate it out, you communicate with it from the position of your consciousness, and then, having gotten the update, it goes. And you'll see as we go that a number of therapeutic techniques echo this in various ways. Chair work is a really interesting one that we'll talk about, not today, but relatively soon, where you are doing sort of parts work. You are interacting with a part of your own mind in a certain way in order to alter the way it comes at you. So, your self-critical split, right? The piece of your mind that's always criticizing you and saying shitty things to you, you can put it in a chair and start having an interaction with it where you let it know how this is making you feel, and its behavior will change. Okay. Last hypnotic example, and then I'll wrap this up. So last hypnotic example I'm going to use is, I was at a conference where I saw some researchers present a case where they used hypnosis to induce artificial dissociative identity disorder. So what they had done, right, was that they, there was a couple of papers actually. So the one was artificial dissociative identity, and the other one was artificial possession, which is equally kind of fascinating. But basically what they did was they used hypnosis to create a sense that there was a secondary person. They basically used selective dissociation to temporarily create a secondary personality in a person. And then they tracked it all by brain imaging techniques to note that it was a completely different pattern. Now, this is an interesting indication because we know from RAS 2007 that hypnosis is dissociative. And of course, dissociative identity disorder is dissociative, but there we have this very strong link. The fact is that hypnosis can be used to replicate the symptomology of dissociative identity disorder, which is fascinating, right? The possession case is sort of related in some ways. So they created an artificial state of possession, basically the idea that something was controlling the body other than the person's primary consciousness. Now, I have no idea how they got this past ethics, to be perfectly honest, but it was a fascinating paper, right? I looked at it, to me, and I was like, well, this seems like you're playing with fire, right? Like, potentially speaking, you have to be very careful with this kind of thing. But the point was, they managed to create this impression where people then felt like they were not in control of their own body temporarily, right? That there was sort of a, something else which was in control of their body, but they did it entirely via hypnotic suggestion. And indeed, there were sort of distinct patterns in brain imaging that seemed to be associated with it. Okay, so those are all the examples I'm going to go through today, but I hope that that creates a spread. And if you watch some of the other associated videos, I hope you get some of that too. That creates a spread for you about this sense of multiplicity. We're going to look at more as we go. But the point that I want to underline here is this: we are not singular unit of beings. And moreover, that dissociation and integration are going to play a key role in our account for how much of this works, including, as we're going to look at next, altered states.